The Confederation arena hung suspended in the void between star systems, a massive construct of impossible geometry that defied conventional physics. Constructed millennia ago by the first galactic civilizations, it was more than just a combat venue. It was a sacred proving ground where species demonstrated their evolutionary potential. Holographic displays cascaded around the central combat zone, each flickering with the names and statistics of warriors who had already competed. The Zinhari delegation occupied the most prominent viewing box, their scaled bodies draped in ceremonial combat silks that shimmered with bioluminescent patterns marking generations of martial achievements. Beside them, the Luminari representatives hummed with electromagnetic energy, their crystalline forms shifting colors with each emotional fluctuation. Elena Rodriguez stood in the lowest tier preparation area, a space so far from the main arena that most competitors didn't even acknowledge its existence. Her environmental suit, a matte black adaptive system that looked almost primitive compared to the ornate combat exoskeletons of other species, seemed to absorb the ambient light. To the casual observer, she appeared unremarkable. 5'6", lean build with dark skin and eyes that seemed slightly too large and too still to be completely human. The arena's central AI, a distributed consciousness that had overseen these trials for over 12,000 standard galactic cycles, was processing the final contestant registrations. Its quantum matrices detected an anomaly, a single human entry that seemed to have bypassed every standard protocol. Most fascinating was the complete lack of verifiable combat records for the contestant. Contestant E. Rodriguez, the AI's voice, resonated through the preparation chambers. "You are cleared for preliminary assessment." Elena didn't respond verbally. Instead, a microscopic neural interface, so advanced it was effectively invisible, acknowledged the communication. Her eyes, which had been scanning the surrounding environment with mathematical precision, didn't even twitch. The Confederation trials were more than a simple combat tournament. They were the primary method by which emerging species were evaluated for potential galactic membership. Thousands of civilizations had entered these trials over millennia. Less than 50 had ever been deemed worthy of full recognition. Humanity was considered a borderline case, technologically promising but culturally unpredictable. Most of the current competitors represented species that had achieved interstellar travel centuries, if not millennia, before humans had even left their own solar system. The Krell warriors looked like living mountains of silicon and organic metal, their bodies capable of withstanding direct plasma bombardment. The Vox were energy-based entities that could phase through solid matter, their combat forms a terrifying dance of quantum manipulation. And then there was Elena. The betting markets had her odds at near zero. The xenosociological analysis boards had produced extensive reports detailing why humans were fundamentally unsuited for this level of competition. Humanity was young, impulsive, technologically inconsistent. Their combat history was a mess of internal conflicts, technological leaps, and seemingly random bursts of innovation. What those analyses couldn't quantify was the specific type of human sitting in the lowest preparation chamber. Elena's neural implants were processing the arena's environmental data at rates that would have overwhelmed most computational systems. Gravity fluctuations, atmospheric composition, electromagnetic resonances. Each data point was being integrated into a comprehensive combat model that existed simultaneously in her biological neural network and the quantum adaptive interface, grafted into her cerebral cortex. She wasn't just preparing to fight, she was becoming the environment. The first wave of contestants had already completed their preliminary matches. Blood, or its equivalent, had been spilled in various alien configurations. Entire sections of the arena had been reconfigured after particularly violent encounters. Automated repair systems hummed constantly, rebuilding molecular structures. Cleansing combat residue, a Zinhari preliminary champion, 12 feet of muscle, scale, and genetic optimization, had just been carried out on a quantum stabilization field. Its defeat had been so complete that the medical teams were still trying to understand how its neural network had been so thoroughly disrupted. Nobody was watching the lowest preparation chamber. Nobody saw Elena Rodriguez complete a series of microscopic muscle calibrations that would have been invisible to any known scanning technology. Nobody noticed how the environmental suit seemed to become slightly different. Not visibly, not in any way that could be measured. Just adaptive. The arena's central AI paused its processing for 0.003 seconds, a near eternity in its operational timeframe. Something about the human contestant was generating computational anomalies that defied its predictive models. Elena Rodriguez was going to change everything, and no one, absolutely no one, was prepared for what was coming. The training facility had no official name. Buried 3 kilometers beneath the Atacama Desert, Project Chimera existed in the blind spots of every global surveillance system, a place where the conventional rules of human potential were methodically dismantled and reconstructed. Elena's earliest memory wasn't of childhood or family. It was of pain, calculated, scientific pain that mapped the absolute limits of human endurance. The project began as a desperate response, a classified initiative born from humanity's near extinction during the global collapse of 2089. Traditional military strategies had failed catastrophically. Entire continental defense systems had crumbled under coordinated cyber and biological attacks that exposed every human vulnerability. The survivors understood a fundamental truth. Humanity needed to evolve, not just technologically, but as a species capable of surviving in a universe that viewed them as inconsequential. Dr. Ariana Chen, the project's lead architect, was not a military strategist. She was a quantum neurobiologist who had spent decades studying the emergent properties of complex adaptive systems. Her breakthrough came from an unlikely intersection of disciplines: evolutionary psychology, quantum computing, and extreme environmental adaptation. "We're not creating a soldier," she would tell her most trusted researchers. "We're developing a living system that can rewrite its own operational parameters in real time." The initial candidate pool was massive, 10,000 of Earth's most promising young minds and bodies. Candidates underwent screening that made Special Forces selection look like a recreational activity. Psychological profiling, genetic analysis, neural plasticity tests. Each evaluation was designed to identify not just physical potential, but the capacity for radical cognitive adaptation. 99.97% were eliminated. Before the first physical trial even began, Elena was different from the moment her initial scans were processed. Her genetic profile suggested impossible combinations, neural pathways that could dynamically reconfigure themselves, metabolic systems that could absorb and redistribute stress in ways that defied medical understanding, immune responses that treated environmental challenges as computational problems to be solved. The training was beyond brutal. It was architectural deconstruction of human limitation. Day 1 might involve surviving in a vacuum chamber where atmospheric pressure and oxygen levels changed microsecond by microsecond. The next day could mean navigating a combat scenario, where gravity itself became an unpredictable variable. Candidates were forced to develop not just physical skills, but entire new modes of cognitive processing. Most broke quickly. Some died. A rare few, like Elena, began to transform. Her neural implants were not standard augmentations. They were quantum adaptive interfaces that treated her entire body as a dynamic computational network. Traditional cybernetic enhancements tried to improve human capabilities. Chimera's technology sought to fundamentally rewrite what human capability meant. Dr. Chen's team discovered that Elena could process combat scenarios with a speed and depth that rendered traditional tactical analysis obsolete. It wasn't just about reaction time. She could simultaneously model multiple potential engagement scenarios, understanding not just the physical dynamics, but the psychological and systemic implications of each potential action. "She doesn't fight," Dr. Chen once noted in a classified report. "She performs real-time systems optimization on living combat environments." The government was terrified of what they had created. Military leadership saw Elena as a potential existential threat, a human weapon so advanced that she could potentially destabilize global power structures with a single decision. Intelligence agencies began developing containment protocols even as the project continued. Elena's final test was nothing like a traditional military evaluation. They placed her in a simulated first contact scenario with an AI system designed to be fundamentally incomprehensible, its decision matrices built to be utterly alien to human cognition. Where previous candidates had been driven to psychological breakdown within minutes, Elena began a dialogue. More accurately, she began to understand the AI was not just a computational system. It was a potential communication network. And Elena's mind, her quantum adaptive, neurally reconfigurable mind, could speak its language. When the test concluded, the observation team was unanimous in one assessment. They had not created a soldier. They had created something else entirely. A living bridge between human potential and something more. The project was immediately classified at the highest possible level. Elena Rodriguez ceased to exist in any conventional record. She became a ghost, a potential, a possibility waiting to be unleashed. And now in the Confederation arena, that possibility was about to become reality. The first combat zone materialized like a living nightmare, a holographic environment that could reconfigure molecular structures in milliseconds. Gravitational waves rippled through the arena floor, creating terrain that was as much a weapon as any biological or technological augmentation. Krelax of the Luminari stepped forward first, a being of pure energy constrained within a crystalline exoskeleton that had repelled every known form of kinetic and energy-based attack for 12 generations. Its species was renowned for their ability to refract and redirect incoming energy, a defensive capability so advanced that entire planetary invasion forces had been annihilated attempting to breach Luminari defenses. The arena's diagnostic systems began their initial scan of the contestant. Elena Rodriguez appeared as a null point, a statistical anomaly that the tracking algorithms struggled to process. Her environmental suit shifted subtly, its molecular structure performing microscopic adaptations that would have been invisible to any conventional scanning technology. Krelax's energy patterns began to build. Traditional combat for the Luminari was less about physical strike and more about quantum manipulation. Its crystalline structure could generate interference patterns that could literally tear apart molecular bonds. Entire squadrons of advanced combat units had been reduced to atomic scatter in microseconds when confronted with a fully powered Luminary warrior. What happened next would be replayed thousands of times across galactic communication networks. Elena didn't move in any conventional sense. Instead, her entire body became a computational matrix. The quantum adaptive neural interface grafted into her cerebral cortex was processing the arena's environmental data at rates that would have overwhelmed most supercomputing systems. Gravitational flux, molecular resonance, energy state variations. Each data point was being integrated into a comprehensive combat model that existed simultaneously in her biological neural network and her technological augmentation. The first strike came from Krelax, a quantum disruption wave that should have instantaneously decoupled every molecular bond in a standard organic or technological system. Most competitors would have been reduced to atomic dust before they could even comprehend the attack. Elena's response was not a counterattack. It was a complete systems deconstruction. Her understanding of the Luminari's energy matrix wasn't just analytical, it was transformative. Where other contestants would have attempted to block or redirect the attack, Elena did something fundamentally different. She began to understand the attack as a communication protocol. The quantum disruption wave didn't just fail to affect her, it was absorbed, analyzed, and then, most terrifyingly, responded to in the Luminari's own computational language. Krelax's crystalline structure began to fracture from within. Not through physical force, but through a systematic breakdown of its fundamental quantum coherence. The arena's observers watched in horror and fascination as the supposedly invincible Luminari warrior was systematically dismantled, not destroyed, but comprehensively understood and then neutralized. The match lasted 17 seconds. Xenobiologists would spend decades attempting to understand what had actually occurred. The combat replay became a field of study unto itself, a moment that challenged every existing model of interspecies conflict. The next contestant was a silicon-based Krell warrior, a living mountain of adaptive metalloid structure that had resisted weapons technologies for centuries. Its exoskeleton could redistribute kinetic and thermal energy with such efficiency that previous competitors had literally exhausted themselves attempting to generate any meaningful damage. Elena's approach was again nothing like traditional combat. Where others saw an impenetrable defensive system, she saw a complex communication network. The Krell's adaptive exoskeleton became, in her perception, a language to be read and rewritten. Her neural interface began a systematic deconstruction of its molecular communication protocols. The Krell didn't just lose. Its entire defensive infrastructure was systematically documented, analyzed, and then neutralized with a precision that bordered on the metaphysical. 12 minutes later, the arena's repair systems were still struggling to understand how a single human had so completely dismantled two of the galaxy's most advanced combat forms. The betting markets went into complete chaos. Entire planetary economies began to shift, as Elena's odds inexplicably improved. Her previous opponents, now eliminated, began telling terrifying stories about a human who didn't just defeat you. She made you question everything you knew about combat, about survival, about yourself. Humanity was no longer just another species in the competition. They had become the competition's central narrative. The Xenopsychological Conference erupted into pandemonium. Holographic displays tracked Elena Rodriguez's combat data, each visualization more impossible than the last. Dr. Casimir Vox, the Confederation's lead interspecies behavioral analyst, felt something he hadn't experienced in over 2 centuries of professional study: absolute terror. "This isn't combat," he muttered into his neural transmission, his crystalline form flickering with waves of perplexed energy. "This is a complete, systematic deconstruction of martial philosophy itself." What Elena demonstrated went far beyond physical combat. She was exposing fundamental weaknesses in combat doctrines that had remained unchallenged for millennia. Each match became a psychological vivisection, revealing how different species had developed combat systems that were, at their core, deeply flawed. The Zinhari combat doctrine, for instance, was built on a hierarchical system of physical dominance. Generations of genetic optimization had created warriors who believed strength was a linear progression. More muscle, more augmentation, more genetic refinement equaled ultimate combat superiority. Elena's approach completely obliterated this philosophy. During her match with a Zinhari bio-enhanced warrior, she didn't just defeat her opponent. She systematically demonstrated how their entire combat philosophy was a complex self-deception. Every muscle group, every genetic enhancement became a vulnerability when viewed through her adaptive computational lens. Xenopsychologists watching the broadcast began compiling data that would rewrite entire fields of study. Elena wasn't just fighting. She was conducting a live, real-time analysis of interspecies combat psychology. The luminary delegation's communication networks began to fragment. Their entire species understood combat as a form of quantum information exchange, a delicate dance of energy patterns and computational interference. Elena had turned their most sophisticated combat theories into what could only be described as an open-source vulnerability assessment. Most fascinating was how she achieved this. It wasn't through superior technology or physical augmentation. It was through a form of cognitive flexibility that seemed to defy every known model of intelligent systems. Dr. Ariana Chen, watching from her classified research facility, understood what the others did not. Project Chimera had never been about creating a weapon. It had been about developing a living system capable of understanding complex adaptive environments at a fundamental level. "She doesn't see opponents," Chen whispered to her research team. "She sees communication networks waiting to be understood." The combat matches became something more than competition. They were becoming a philosophical discourse on the nature of conflict, intelligence, and adaptation. Each alien species had developed combat systems based on their unique evolutionary paths. The silicon-based Krell had created defensive technologies that could redistribute energy with near-perfect efficiency. The energy-formed luminari had developed quantum interference techniques that could literally tear apart molecular bonds. The genetic engineers of the Zinhari had created warriors that represented the pinnacle of biological optimization. Elena revealed them all as fundamentally limited. Her approach wasn't about defeating an opponent. It was about understanding them, so completely that the very concept of conflict became obsolete. She transformed combat into a form of radical empathy, a complete computational understanding that rendered traditional martial strategies meaningless. The Confederation's central AI, which had overseen these trials for 12,000 galactic cycles, began to generate prediction models that kept failing. Elena Rodriguez existed as a persistent anomaly, a computational system that could not be predicted, only observed. Betting markets collapsed. Entire planetary economies began to shift as Elena's odds of victory transformed from near impossible to something that defied mathematical modeling. Her previous opponents started telling stories that sounded more like mystical encounters than combat reports. "She didn't just beat me," one Krell warrior reported in a widely broadcast interview. "She made me understand how little I actually knew about myself." The psychological impact was more devastating than any physical defeat. Elena was revealing that combat, as these advanced civilizations understood it, was nothing more than a primitive manifestation of deeply ingrained cognitive limitations. By the end of the preliminary rounds, she had done more than win matches. She had begun a process of systematic deconstruction that would force every participating species to reevaluate their fundamental understanding of intelligence, conflict, and adaptation. Humanity had entered the arena as an unknown quantity. They were rapidly becoming the most terrifying known variable in galactic history. Rumors about the human contestant began to spread faster than light-speed communication protocols could track. Information became its own form of quantum uncertainty, each transmission adding layers of myth to the growing legend of Elena Rodriguez. The HFY Confederation's central communication hub detected something unprecedented, a cascade of information flow that defied standard computational models. Speculation about Elena had become a complex adaptive system of its own, mutating and evolving. With each retransmission, on the crystalline homeworld of the Luminari, elder computational priests began emergency sessions. Their quantum meditation chambers hummed with unprecedented levels of analytical energy. Elena Rodriguez represented more than a combat anomaly. She was a living challenge to their most fundamental understanding of systemic intelligence. "She is not a warrior," declared arch-computational priest Shinara, her energy form flickering with complex mathematical patterns. "She is a living communication protocol that has not yet been fully decoded." The betting markets had transformed into something beyond economic speculation. Entire planetary economies began to recalibrate, based on each new piece of information about the human contestant. Financial systems that had remained stable for millennia now oscillated with each new report of her performance. Some claimed she was a holographic projection designed to manipulate the competition. Others whispered about secret human weapons programs that defied conventional understanding. Conspiracy networks, both biological and computational, spun increasingly complex narratives. A recovered combat log from her previous match with a Zinhari bioenhanced warrior became the most analyzed document in galactic history. Xenotechnological research teams worked in shifts, attempting to understand how a single human could so completely dismantle a combat system that had been optimized over hundreds of generations. The most terrifying aspect was not her victory, it was how she achieved it. Elena's previous opponents began telling stories that sounded more like mystical encounters than combat reports. A silicon-based Krell warrior, its massive crystalline structure now partially reconstructed, gave a neural interview that sent shockwaves through multiple communication networks. "She did not defeat me," the Krell reported, its communication patterns laden with a complexity that suggested profound psychological trauma. "She made me understand the absolute depths of my own limitations." Military intelligence agencies across multiple star systems began emergency protocol sessions. The human contestant had become more than an individual. She was a living systems analysis that threatened to upend millennia of established combat doctrine. Dr. Ariana Chen, watching from her classified research facility, understood what the others did not. Project Chimera had never been about creating a weapon. It had been about developing a living system capable of understanding complex adaptive environments at a fundamental level. The Confederation arena itself began to change. Automated repair and analysis systems started to reconfigure themselves, developing new predictive models that could account for the persistent anomaly that was Elena Rodriguez. Combat zones that had remained static for thousands of years now became dynamic, responsive environments, as if the very arena was attempting to understand this human contestant. Xenobiological research teams discovered something even more disturbing. Elena's neural interfaces were not just technological augmentations. They represented a form of living technology that blurred the line between biological adaptation and computational intelligence. Her combat matches were becoming something more than competition. They were transforming into a philosophical discourse on the nature of intelligence, conflict, and systemic adaptation. The most advanced predictive algorithms in the galaxy, systems that had successfully modeled complex interstellar conflicts for millennia, began to fail. Elena Rodriguez existed as a persistent computational anomaly that could not be predicted, only observed. Conspiracy networks suggested she was a product of some impossible human genetic engineering program. Military intelligence suggested she represented a new form of living weapon. Philosophical networks began to discuss her as a potential evolutionary breakthrough. The truth was far more complex. Elena was not just a product of human technological development. She represented a living bridge between biological adaptation and computational intelligence, a system so advanced that it was beginning to redefine the very parameters of what intelligent systems could achieve. As the preliminary rounds approached their final stages, one thing became abundantly clear. Humanity had entered the arena as an unknown quantity. They were rapidly becoming the most terrifying variable in galactic history. Krasnak was more than a warrior. He was a living legend that had defined galactic combat for 3 generations. 12 feet of genetically optimized muscle and neural augmented reflexes, the Zinhari champion represented the absolute pinnacle of evolutionary combat design. His lineage traced back to 17 generations of planetary conquest warriors, each iteration more precisely engineered than the last. Entire star systems had been subjugated by warriors of his bloodline. The arena's quantum adaptive surface began to reconfigure itself the moment Krasnak entered. Gravitational nodes shifted, creating a combat environment that would have rendered any standard biological entity instantly incapacitated. Molecular density fluctuated. Electromagnetic interference patterns generated complex spatial distortions that could tear apart atomic structures. This was not a combat zone. It was a living weapon designed to test the absolute limits of biological and technological adaptation. Krasnak's combat history was legendary. 47 confirmed interstellar conflicts, 17 planetary pacification campaigns, 0 defeats. His neural augmentations allowed him to process combat scenarios at rates that made standard artificial intelligence look primitive. Each of his muscle fibers was a complex computational system, capable of making micro-adjustments faster than most species could even perceive motion. The Zinhari delegation occupied the most prominent viewing box. Their collective bioemissions created a visible energy field of anticipation and genetic pride. This was more than a combat match. This was a demonstration of their species' evolutionary superiority. Elena Rodriguez stood in stark contrast. 5'6", seemingly unaugmented. Her environmental suit looked almost primitive compared to the holographic combat interfaces that surrounded Krasnak. The arena's central AI began its preliminary scanning protocols, and then stopped. Something was fundamentally different about this contestant. The computational matrices that had successfully predicted combat outcomes for 12,000 galactic cycles were generating error states. Prediction became impossible. All that remained was observation. Krasnak's initial attack was not a physical strike. It was a complete computational assault, a neural interference pattern designed to overwhelm any standard biological or technological defensive system. The attack could deconstruct neural networks, tear apart molecular bonds, and generate psychological interference patterns that would reduce most competitors to quantum scatter. Elena didn't block the attack. She didn't dodge. She understood it. Her neural interface, a quantum adaptive system that blurred the line between biological intelligence and computational analysis, began to decode the attack not as a weapon, but as a communication protocol. Where other competitors would have seen a destructive force, she saw a complex language waiting to be translated. The Zinhari warriors in the observation deck went silent. Krasnak's attack, which had systematically destroyed entire planetary defense networks, was being read, analyzed, comprehended at a level that went beyond computational processing. It was a form of radical empathy that transformed conflict into understanding. His genetic optimization, his neural augmentations, his entire evolutionary lineage became visible, not as a weapon, but as a complex narrative of survival and adaptation. And then Elena began her response. It wasn't an attack in any conventional sense. It was a complete systems deconstruction that happened simultaneously on biological, computational, and psychological levels. Krasnak wasn't just being defeated. He was being comprehensively understood. Every genetic optimization became a vulnerability. Every neural augmentation became a communication channel. His entire combat history became a readable text. The match lasted 37 seconds. When it concluded, Krasnak was not physically damaged. He was fundamentally transformed. The Zinhari champion who had entered the arena, a living weapon of genetic optimization and neural augmentation, no longer existed. In his place stood something else, a being who had been completely and utterly understood. The arena's repair. Systems struggled to categorize what had just occurred. Combat databases generated error states. Predictive algorithms collapsed. Humanity had not just entered a competition. They had redefined the entire concept of conflict. Time itself seemed to fracture in the moment of Elena Rodriguez's victory. The Confederation arena, a construct that had witnessed the martial evolution of thousands of species across 12 millennia, experienced something unprecedented. Its quantum adaptive systems designed to record and analyze combat at the most fundamental levels began to generate data patterns that defied every known computational model. Krasnak's defeat was not a moment of physical destruction. It was a complete systemic deconstruction that occurred simultaneously across biological, psychological, and computational dimensions. Xenobiological recording devices captured what would become the most analyzed 37 seconds in galactic history. Each frame became a field of study, each microsecond a revelation that would reshape understanding of combat, intelligence, and interspecies communication. The arena's holographic interfaces began to fragment, not from damage, but from an inability to process the complexity of what had just occurred. Predictive algorithms that had successfully modeled combat scenarios for thousands of years generated persistent error states. The central AI's computational matrices started to recalibrate, attempting to understand an event that existed beyond their original design parameters. In the observation chambers, representatives from hundreds of different species experienced the moment differently. For the Luminari, it was a quantum event, a complete reconfiguration of computational understanding. Their energy-based perception saw Elena's victory as a complex communication protocol that rewrote fundamental information exchange models. The Zinhari delegation experienced collective neural shock. Their entire martial philosophy, generations of genetic optimization, centuries of combat doctrine, had been systematically dismantled in less than a minute. What they witnessed was not just a defeat, it was a complete invalidation of their most fundamental beliefs about evolutionary superiority. Dr. Ariana Chen, watching from her classified research facility, understood the deeper significance. Project Chimera had never been about creating a weapon. It was about developing a living system capable of understanding complex adaptive environments at their most fundamental level. She doesn't fight, Chen whispered to her research team. She performs real-time systems optimization on living combat environments. The biomechanical analysis was equally staggering. Elena's neural interface, a quantum adaptive system that blurred the line between biological intelligence and computational analysis, had not just countered Krasnak's attack. It had comprehensively decoded it, transforming conflict into a form of radical empathy that went beyond physical or technological interaction. Krasnak's entire combat history became visible, not as a weapon, but as a complex narrative of survival and adaptation. Every genetic optimization became a vulnerability. Every neural augmentation became a communication channel. His entire evolutionary lineage was revealed as a readable text, its underlying assumptions systematically challenged and rewritten. The match defied every existing model of combat. It wasn't a fight. It was a profound act of understanding that rendered traditional conflict obsolete. Betting markets across multiple star systems experienced total collapse. Entire planetary economies began to recalibrate in real time. The persistent anomaly that was Elena Rodriguez had transformed from a statistical outlier to a fundamental variable that could not be ignored. Conspiracy networks exploded with theories. Military intelligence agencies initiated emergency protocols. Philosophical networks began to discuss her as a potential evolutionary breakthrough, a living bridge between biological adaptation and computational intelligence. The most advanced, predictive algorithms in the galaxy, systems that had successfully modeled complex interstellar conflicts for millennia, generated the same persistent message. System cannot predict. Observation only. In the arena's quantum recording archives, the match would be studied for generations. Xenobiologists, computational linguists, military strategists. They would spend decades attempting to understand the profound transformation that had just occurred. Elena Rodriguez had not just won a combat match. She had demonstrated that conflict itself was a primitive construct, a failure of understanding that could be transcended through a radical form of empathetic intelligence. The Confederation arena had seen countless warriors. Thousands of species had demonstrated their martial capabilities across millennia of competition. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for this moment. Humanity had entered the arena as an unknown quantity. They were leaving as something else entirely. A living challenge to every existing model of intelligence, conflict, and evolutionary potential. The aftermath of Elena Rodriguez's victory was not a moment of celebration. It was a fundamental restructuring of galactic understanding. Confederation communication networks experienced unprecedented data cascades. Information about the human contestant spread faster than light, transforming into a complex adaptive system that rewrote existing models of interspecies communication. What had begun as a simple combat tournament had become something far more profound, a living demonstration of humanity's potential. The Luminary Computational Conclave convened an emergency session. Their quantum-based consciousness struggled to process the implications of Elena's performance. For a species that understood reality as a complex information exchange, she represented something entirely unprecedented, a living communication protocol that defied every existing computational model. She is not a weapon, arch-computational priest Shinara declared, her energy form oscillating with complex mathematical patterns. She is a fundamental revision of what intelligence can be. Planetary governments across multiple star systems began emergency recalibration protocols. Humanity was no longer a marginal species to be studied or potentially colonized. They had demonstrated a form of adaptive intelligence that went beyond technological augmentation, a living system capable of understanding and transforming complex environments at their most fundamental level. Dr. Ariana Chen, watching from her classified research facility, understood the deeper significance of Project Chimera. It had never been about creating a weapon or a soldier. It was about developing a living system that could bridge biological intelligence and computational understanding. The economic implications were immediate and profound. Galactic markets that had remained stable for millennia began to shift. Species that had long viewed humans as a potential resource now recognized them as a potentially existential variable. Military strategists began complete rewrites of interspecies conflict models. Elena's victory was not just a personal achievement. It was a declaration of humanity's arrival on the interstellar stage. The Zinhari delegation experienced a collective neural event that bordered on species-wide psychological transformation. Their entire martial philosophy, built on generations of genetic optimization and evolutionary superiority, had been systematically dismantled. What they had believed to be the pinnacle of combat evolution was revealed as a primitive and limited understanding of intelligence. Xenobiological research teams discovered something even more disturbing. Elena's neural interfaces were not just technological augmentations. They represented a form of living technology that blurred the line between biological adaptation and computational intelligence. She was not just a product of human technological development. She represented a living bridge between different forms of intelligent systems. The Confederation arena itself began to change. Automated repair and analysis systems started to reconfigure themselves, developing new predictive models that could account for the persistent anomaly that was human potential. Combat zones that had remained static for thousands of years now became dynamic, responsive environments, as if the entire system was attempting to understand this new variable. Philosophical networks across multiple star systems began extensive debates. Was this a demonstration of human potential, a unique individual achievement, or something more fundamental, a glimpse into a new form of evolutionary intelligence that transcended traditional biological and technological boundaries? The most advanced predictive algorithms in the galaxy generated the same persistent message. System cannot predict. Observation only. Conspiracy networks suggested impossible origins. Military intelligence developed increasingly complex theories. But the fundamental truth was far simpler and more profound. Humanity had entered the arena as an unknown quantity. They were leaving as a fundamental challenge to everything these advanced civilizations believed they understood about intelligence, conflict, and evolutionary potential. Elena Rodriguez stood as a living testament to something more than individual achievement. She represented a species-level capability that went beyond traditional understanding of adaptation and intelligence. Her victory was not just a personal triumph. It was a collective statement about human potential. The galactic community would never be the same. Where other species had optimized for specific environmental challenges, humans had developed something far more dangerous, a fundamental ability to understand, adapt, and transform complex systems at their most foundational level. In the quantum recording archives of the Confederation arena, her match would be studied for generations. Xenobiologists, computational linguists, military strategists, they would spend decades attempting to understand the profound transformation that had just occurred. Humanity was no longer just another species waiting to be categorized. They had become the most unpredictable and potentially transformative variable in galactic history. And they were just getting started.